Before we start today, I'd like to do the Acknowledgement of Country. So on behalf of those present, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia and hope the path towards reconciliation continues to be shared and embraced. So welcome everyone. As you know, we've got a little small awards team that is running a set of professional development programs. Myself, Director of the award, the National Awards, running now for the 5th year. So good to see they're still running. Angeline Sim, who's been the awards manager, that's been instrumental in making sure everything's organised and running according to schedule, timeline, lots of work behind the scenes. And Jin, who's helping us with all the technical aspects, helping us put together the newsletter and a number of other coordination activities. Today, we are going to be focused on tips and skills for writing a successful citation application. And I'm delighted to have one presenter and 2 guests that were previous citation winners that will join me in a conversation around putting together a citation application. The first presenter, I'm delighted to have her today, Elizabeth Johnson. I've known Liz for quite some time now. Good to see you, Liz. Her substantive role is Deputy Vice-Chancellor Education at Deakin University. Huge university, huge responsibility, providing strategic educational leadership across the whole university. And on the side, she does a number of other things. And one of the other things she does is being involved in the Australian Awards for University Teaching. And she's been committed to that for quite some time. And more recently, she's taken on the role as chair of the Citations Awards Committee. So she gets to see all of the applications, and then her and her team got the biggest job out of all the panels, Liz, and then they make the recommendation of who should be the recipients of those awards, and that goes to the Universities Australia Board. So I'm delighted to have her here today. I've also got 2 past recipients that are joining me today as well. First, I've got Associate Professor Jane Frost. She's from the University of Canberra and she leads the You Can Nurse Better team. Her citation, together with Catherine Sansbury and her team, was for approaches for teaching that motivate and inspire students. And her focus was on developing and implementing a capstone unit to consolidate learning through social strategies and a desire to promote a culture of belongingness. And joining me as well is Associate Professor Christine Barry from Flinders University. Her citation also for approaches to teaching that motivate by students. And she's focused on anatomical foundations of clinical excellence, evidence-based approaches that overcome cognitive barriers, and developing cognitive awareness that inspire clinically oriented student learning. I'm really glad to join us here today. Liz is going to give us some insights as a chair of the Citations Committee around how you would go about deciding on which categories, some tips in putting together an application and a number of other insights. And then I'll have a conversation with Christine and Jane around their experience in putting together a citation and some of the challenges that they may have faced, how they overcame them, and then some quick tips for putting together a successful application. And then I'll pass back to Angeline and she'll give you some details about what other PD sessions coming in the near future and timeline and all sort of the administrative work that goes behind the scenes. Let's start with Elizabeth Johnson.
Thanks, Angie. What a pleasure it is to be here today, and hello to everybody. I'm joining you today from Wurundjeri country in the middle of Melbourne, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for their care of country and their leadership in education, which is really very relevant here today. There is so much that we can learn from our First Nations colleagues about different forms of education and how to approach education in time-honoured ways. We welcome their contribution. Today I'm going to rattle through a whole lot of things. A lot of the information that I'm talking about today can be found on AAUT's website and supporting areas, and I do want to acknowledge the terrific work that's done by individual institutional teams in supporting applications. 4 big points to cover today. Why an AAUT citation in the first place? How would you get started? What are the categories and criteria, and a little about narrative and evidence. I realise that for many of you, this will be old news. and you'll understand a lot about the citation, but I am going to go through it in a bit of detail to make sure that we're all on the same page. The first thing to keep in mind is why we're so passionate about this, and it's because the business of higher education is transformative. We are making a real difference to our learners, and I might add to ourselves. So we are building our own capacity, capability to be the best that we can be and to get the best outcomes for our learners, and thereby the best outcome for our communities. The point about awards is to highlight excellence, because excellence is inspiring. When you have the privilege, as I do, of seeing a lot of different applications coming through, it is days of beautiful, inspiring reading. When it comes around, I think, right, I'm going to put everything else aside so I can concentrate on this, because it takes my whole self and I get so excited about being in the midst of it. And I know my panel does, and I know the other panels do as well. We are seeing the best of learning and teaching in Australia, and that learning and teaching, that excellence, is going to broker better student outcomes. Understanding how we build excellence builds capability, but it also builds confidence. It helps us to recognise what excellence is and to have faith in our work and the work of our colleagues. And of course, as we can see here today, the national awards build networks and communities of practice, and that gives us strength for disruptions that come our way, notably the last 2 years of pandemic. If you think back on it, where would we have been without our communities of practice? The citations themselves are for outstanding contributions to student learning. If we think about it, outstanding contributions are those that are significant, that is, they have a tangible impact on student learning, and this is what the panel is looking for, what your assessors are looking for, that they're leading, they go beyond normal design, delivery or support. Now, what do I mean by normal? The last 2 years have certainly not been normal, but it's where you're making significant advance, whatever that might be, doing something in a revised, better way that produces really step change in outcomes, bringing in something that's new and innovative, influencing service delivery or building capability in your colleagues. You're looking for things that are making a step change in the way students learn and our colleagues and we teach. Citations need to be evidence-based to be outstanding, because we need something to judge you by. So the evidence base is really important, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on. The other point that a lot of citation applicants and winners find by experience is that the process is both purposeful and reflective. It has to create a cohesive narrative. Remember, when you're writing for anybody in the higher education sector. They're not going to be specialists in your team. So you need to present them with a narrative, a story, which gives the essence of what you were trying to achieve. We'll come back to these ideas as we move through the presentation. The starting point is the AAUT website. I am willing to bet that the large majority of you attending today know exactly where that AAUT website is. It contains the citation nomination instructions. Please read them, just as much as we want all our students to read the instructions we give them for assessment. Please make sure you do likewise. It will make the job of your assessors so much easier, and it will make your application much, much easier to understand. So please pay attention to that. I'd also draw your attention to the AAUT Network website, which is a community of past winners and people who are interested, and there's great tip there to help you prepare your application. And as I acknowledged earlier, there are Learning and Teaching Awards teams in most institutions. Please find yours. I'm hoping you know them already. They have enormous resources to draw on and heaps of experience. You will have past winners, mentors and learning and teaching leaders in your community that you can draw on. And if there's not someone there in your particular discipline, I'm sure that they will find someone to help you review and think about your application. There is still an AAUT network mentoring scheme through the website, so get in touch with them and find a mentor. Don't try and do this on your own. It's a big thing to do, and that purposeful and reflective process really benefits from mentoring. doing. So let's have a look at how the nominations actually work. You'll see when you go into the instructions that there's a whole stack of decisions that you have to make. And the first one is, where does your award fit? We'll ask you what discipline category you wish to belong to. And then there are a series of nomination categories because we're calling out some diverse groups to make sure that they are well represented in the awards. So the discipline group, I will leave that up to your judgment. The nomination categories include early career applicants, the Neville Bonner Award for Indigenous Educators, and sessional staff. If you're not in one of those three categories, please, you belong with other. That's everybody else. And make sure you do tick that box so we can make sure it goes to the right place. The second decision that you have to make is, which subcategory are you choosing? And this is about, what did you actually do? Now, there's a lot of overlap between these categories in terms of you can adapt your work in a number of different ways in most cases. So you need to choose the category which suits your work and your evidence best. We'll come back and have a deep look at that. And the third element to consider is the assessment criteria. Now, in this case, you have to satisfy all the assessment criteria. So make sure when you're thinking about your narrative, your story and your evidence, that you're looking across all these four elements, that your work has made a positive impact over time, that it's been recognised, and there are many ways that it can have been recognised, that you're presenting the creativity and imagination and or innovation that you put into it, and that it's grounded in scholarly work. That means we expect that you will tell us about where it sits in relation to the scholarly literature. So let's look a little bit deeper into the subcategories, because these can be quite confusing. So there's four. What you're really thinking about here is, where does your evidence sit best and what kind of story you're going to tell. So you will choose between approaches to teaching and or the support of learning that influence, motivate and inspire students to learn, or development of curricular resources or services that reflect a command of the field, or effective assessment practices that bring about improvements in student teaching focused on academic integrity, or innovation or leadership that has influenced and enhanced learning and teaching and or the student experience. Now, when you think about your work, it's quite likely, as I said, that it could fall under one or more of these categories. So let's have a look even further to see what you might think about when you're looking at those categories and when you're comparing those categories. So when you're thinking about approaches to teaching and or supportive learning, and I'm really delighted that our two panellists have both chosen that, because it's a quite broad category and they'll have quite different views on how they came to choose it. Consider things like your teaching philosophy. This category particularly welcomes applications that are integrative, cohesive, looking across, drawing curriculum together and having an influence as an approach to learning and teaching rather than a piece of. So think in terms of cohesion and impact over a broader remit. If you're looking at the second one, development of curricular resources and services that reflect a command of the field, consider where your impact lies and then think about how you've made that reflect your field. So this is where disciplinary based learning often appears, or specific resources. Maybe it's a learning module or some text-based resources or tool that is particularly useful in developing learning and teaching in your area. Our second two categories, effective assessment practices. Think about all aspects of assessment. Think about feedback. Think about the design of assessment, the mechanisms of delivery of assessment. Think about authenticity. Think about integrity. And I've popped in there evaluative judgment as code for me to think about the skills that assessment practices develop. So evaluative judgment is the capacity to judge the work of peer and others. So that skill that comes out of assessment, and you can think about the skill development that you're doing through the assessment process as well. And then the last category is innovation or leadership. And this is quite, again, another open category. But here I suggest you really start thinking about your sphere of influence. Where have you shown innovation? Is it innovative just in your area? Was it an innovation that was taken out to your whole institution? Was it an innovation that went out to your whole discipline? So think about your sphere of influence and think about where you expect that innovation or influence to have impact. Are you looking at a national stage or an international stage? Remember, there are different kinds of leadership. You don't need a formal position to be a leader, and I hope people in this room understand it because you're leaders or you wouldn't be here. Think about the different kinds of leadership that you exercise, whether it's influence on a colleague, whether it's taking leadership around a particular activity in your institution or discipline. There are many kinds of leadership to consider. So try it on for size. Test out your story, your thinking, your evidence against the 4 categories and try and work out where it's strongest. And this is a moment where it's really good to talk to your mentor or your local Learning and Teaching Awards team or even a colleague that has won before and get them to talk through with you how best to place your application. So let's have a quick look at the assessment criteria. Remember that you need to address all of the assessment criteria, not just one. When we talk about impact, and I'll come back to this when we look at evidence, we're not just looking about what you've done, but what the effect of that was. So you need to go beyond the doing to the outcomes. You're thinking beyond. Remember, the period is no less than 3 years. Please, if you're in any doubt, check with your awards team. Make sure that you're really clear about whether it's time for your application to come forward or whether it needs to wait a year. Recognition can come from colleagues, from institute, from disciplines, from broader community, from industry partners. There's lots of places recognition can come from. But when you think about whether or not it meets that criteria for outstanding, you're looking for things that go above and beyond. The normal thank yous, lovely though they are not going to make your application outstanding. So you're looking for the bits where it's a recognition of a bigger impact. Creativity, imagination and innovation. If you're developing or redeveloping or reimagining work, then this is very familiar territory to you. Make sure that in your application, your flavour of that comes through. And as I said earlier, make sure that your application is well grounded in the scholarly literature. It does not need to be a literature review. You haven't got many words. Please don't try and reproduce a literature review, but make sure that we understand that you know where your work is placed in the broader scheme of things. There are some excellent tips that come from the assessors' tips each year on writing successful application, and you'll find them on the AAUT website. And here's 3 that I pulled out about building the idea of narrative. I really like these. Think of writing process as a 3-legged stool. Firstly, make the claim. Secondly, tell us about the impact. Thirdly, give us the evidence. Very clear, isn't it? A nice, clear narrative. But the other 2 things are important too. Find a hook for your work. Create a narrative, but use data to bring it to life. So make sure there's coherence. It's not a jumble of a list of things that you've done. There's a link between all of it, which brings a collective narrative together. And the one in blue, the best nominations are those which really give you a sense of the nominee as an educator, what makes him or her unique. While staying within the context and criteria, make sure it is your story that is being told. Stories are much easier for your assessors to engage with. But the story's got to be backed up with evidence. So let's have a quick look at evidence. This will be familiar territory for many of you. Think about the kinds of evidence that you are collecting. You will all, I'm sure, have lots of evidence around perceptions, and we often talk about student feedback surveys, whether they're the routine ones that come out of your institution or whether you've commissioned some in particular for this. They are about perceptions. They're certainly valid, very helpful, but please think carefully about how you use them. I can guarantee to you that every application we receive will have high quality student feedback in it. Just getting a good feedback score is not enough. It's showing an impact on perceptions, but you really need to go further. I've pulled out sort of 3 other things to think about. Behaviours, what did people do? And the target of your work may be right here in behaviours. Did I shift the way students engaged with the material? Did I shift the way students engaged with industry? That kind of evidence, very valuable, and Put it in terms of the target of your work. The outcomes are what happened. That might be results, grades, marks. It might be achievements. What did your students achieve? What did your teaching team achieve? What skills can they now demonstrate that they couldn't before or were difficult for them to demonstrate before? Remember, this idea of impact sits across all of them. What changed and did it last? So think about graduate outcomes in terms of the longer picture. Did it affect, and not everybody's work will do this, but what would the downstream effects be on employment and life skills? What would be different about learning, teaching and experience for future cohorts? Do you have independent evaluation and or peer review? Some applicants do that by scholarly publication, which has been peer reviewed. Many ways to show it, but whatever you're doing, think about evidence beyond a simple single metric. Which brings me to the second set of comments about evidence. Make sure when you're thinking about it that you critique your own data and ask a friend to do it with you. It's easy to get down in the weeds because we see our own data all the time and you're all looking there for the bit that's most interesting for you. Remember, when the assessors see it, they're coming in to look at it globally. So you need to make clear what in your data is providing the evidence of being outstanding, and make sure that you bring that data set together, triangulate the data, make sure that it talks to each other. Show it's sustained with longitudinal data wherever you can. I know and I appreciate it's not always possible to do that, but if you've got that data, it's quite powerful and it shows impact over time. You'll probably use both qualitative and quantitative data. If you're using qualitative data, be careful about the length of quotes that you use. You haven't got much space. So make sure that if you're using quotes, they say something distinctive, that they're not just another repeat of "that was lovely, thank you." It should add to your narrative and evidence it. Make sure when you're presenting data that you explain the context for the data. Remember, the people reading it are not in your institution and they're quite likely not in your field. So you need to explain to them why something is exceptional. And again, put it in context with the literature. If there's literature out there where people have already measured the things that you're measuring or have done comparable kinds of interventions, refer to it. Make sure that we know that you're in contact with the literature. Finally, putting it all together. I know you're organised because you're here. Well done. Make sure that you give yourself sufficient preparation time. It's longer than you think. Give yourself time not just to write, but also to interact with others and get their feedback on it. It is a reflective process, and even if you don't put your application in this year, you will be much, much better prepared for next year and for any other kind of application you want to put forward. As I said at the beginning, please, please, please talk to others, mentors, reviewers, your institutional team. Just a quick word about formatting. Please think about the assessors. They're reading lots of these, many dozens of them. If you make it easier for them to read, then they will get your story that much better. So please address the criteria, use recognisable headers, create that story and explain the context and significance. Now, I've rattled through that at 1,000,000 miles an hour, but I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for both questions and for our panellists who can bring all this to life. You will find all of this on the AAUT website, so please use it. Please get in there and have a dig around and talk to each other about how to present your brilliant work, and I'm looking forward to reading it. Thank you, Ange.
Thank you so much, Liz. Can everyone just give Liz a virtual clap? Because that was just brilliant, Liz. You just summarised it so lovely. Loved your analogy with the three-legged stool. And hopefully that resonated with some of the award-winning applicants and some of those that are about to put together an application. So I'll just check if there's anyone that's got a question.
I am the advisor for the RMIT Vietnam Teaching Award, so it's not like the national one. I have one question here about the criteria number 4. It's about leadership. So I want to understand a little bit more, like what does leadership here exactly mean? Because I remember Liz said that like applicant does not need to hold a leadership or like a managerial position. Can you please explain more about that, the leadership one?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and people often or may struggle a little bit to claim leadership. You think you're just the helper or the facilitator, but that's leadership too. The kind of leadership I'm thinking about is where you've championed something. It might be that you were were the person that decided to lead a group of colleagues in some work on assessment practice, or you were the kind of person that was helping out with first year transition and you led an intervention which really helped students to reorient to higher education. That doesn't mean that you've been given a formal role to do it. It meant that you were the person that instigated, led, facilitated, and or perhaps evaluated that work and made sure that it had impact. It's how you describe it, and the evidence that you would give for your leadership is some feedback from your colleagues. This is where a quote from somebody who can testify to your leadership really helps, but you can also do it through other sort of positional things such as I led the project on, or I have worked with my national disciplinary peak body at. Those kind of things will help us to see what your leadership looks like. But this is an area where Angela is an expert, so I'm going to ask her for a comment.
Yes, Liz, I think back when we both got our fellowships, we perhaps weren't senior leaders in our institution. You definitely weren't a DVC, and I definitely was an associate DVC. But we actually came up with initiative that did require leadership because we were trying to change cultures or change behaviours in our project. There are many examples where you can lead without having that positional leadership. So, Katie, you've got another question.
Thank you very much. You talked about how what we do might well go over the 4 categories and we need to choose a category. That's clear. I'm just wondering to what extent it might be better to omit things that perhaps more properly belong in another category, or whether it's actually good to somehow demonstrate you do go beyond that category by mentioning things that are certainly relevant.
It's a juggling act, Katie. The important thing here is cohesive narrative and sufficient evidence to show that it's outstanding. No, you won't be able to fit in everything you ever do. Most people here work hard and they have lots and lots of things that they're doing all the time. Choose the things that support your narrative. Find that central philosophy, approach, action, initiative. Find that central thing which you think captures the most impact, and then see what fits around it and into it to evidence it. So you may find sometimes, though, that it's disparate pieces that come together where you think, why was I doing that? Why did I think of that? And then you see how it comes into the narrative, where in a different environment you might treat it quite differently. It's good to have multiple forms of evidence. It's good to triangulate that evidence and make sure that it connects with itself. But you're right, you don't want to just have a list. So make sure that the narrative comes together.
Thank you.
Great advice, Liz. Okay, so if we can now move to our 2 Citation Award recipients. We've just heard Liz and we've talked about selecting the right criteria and how important evidence is and the impact of your work. And I just thought if I could get each of you, starting with you, Jane, and then Christine, if you could share a little bit of your experience in preparing your citation application.
It was really great to hear Liz talk. A lot of the things really resonated with me about what she was saying. I think trying to figure out which subcategory was a big part of the journey and which we fitted into best. Another thing was the hook that you mentioned. Title, You Can Nurse Better, probably sounds kind of a bit obscure, but it actually stood for the University of Canberra Nursing was the first bit. Better is actually stands for belonging to the profession, engaging in learning, working together, being a team, engaging in emotion and preparing for reality, which were creating that kind of narrative, even just in title, sort of helped us to bring that cohesion to what we were talking about. So I think that hook really helped, having a clear educational pedagogy that we were working to. We particularly looked at Wegner's social learning, so being able to actually show a diagram which added colour and a little bit of difference in the citation. It was really hard to get that in there because trying to fit that in the 4 pages was quite hard to do. The last person who asked the questions about adding extra stuff, I think when you start writing it, you have to take so much out. And I think that is really hard to do when you're writing things that you're really passionate about and you're like, well, I want to talk about that and I want to talk about this and I want to talk about the other. So I think when we first wrote ours, it was sort of 12 pages long and we had to get it down to 4 because you actually then have to go okay, well, we kind of say that over there, even though that says we're fantastic. I'm going to have to take that out because it really doesn't say anything apart from a subjective comment from a student. So I think that was one of the hard bits, was trying to cut it down. But I think I particularly found that it was advantageous to work in a team. Myself and my colleague, Catherine Sainsbury, who couldn't be here today, we worked together and we were able to talk each other out of, well, I really liked this bit, and we were able to moderate each other to be able to go, well, that was my idea and I want that in there, but to actually moderate what needed to go in and showcase what we'd done.
Thanks, Jane. That's great. I'd now like to ask Christine. Jane talked about having a hook, and that was something that Liz mentioned. What was your journey like, Christine?
Thanks, Liz and Jane. My experience very much resonated with the things that you said. For me, the experience really started with one of my colleagues, Vula Gaganis. She kind of said to me, let's do this. We did put in separate applications, but we sort of did push each other, really. Like, all teachers were very busy, and at different times we kind of nudged each other to get over the line last year. And the first thing we did was go and meet with Anna Smith, our institutional contact officer, the awards team person at Flinders. Anna was fantastic. I was quite focused on a very specific thing I'd done in a specific anatomy class to help students learn pelvic anatomy. Female pelvic anatomy is one of the parts of anatomy that medical students and junior doctors say they feel very underconfident in their knowledge regarding this. And I think, as a woman and a mother of daughters, I feel horrified that doctors might feel this way, and I was quite motivated to do something about this. When I looked at why that was the case, when I looked at the educational theory around learning and how that applies to anatomy learning, there was a whole lot of reasons why female pelvic anatomy was tricky to learn. We set about a particular innovation to improve the learning. So I was quite focused on this innovation, and Anna was fantastic, helping me step back and go, okay, so what else has been happening in your curriculum? What else have you done to improve anatomy learning? And what about the whole reproductive anatomy curriculum? What's happened in that in the last few years since you've been looking after that? And it was so much broader than the way I'd been thinking about it initially.